Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, and good afternoon to us all, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges and friends alike. Today, Proposition Teams attempts to frame student loans as the solution to Indonesia's severe educational crisis. They claim that by allowing students to borrow money, education suddenly becomes accessible and opportunities explode in equality. However, we as opposition team firmly rejects this framing, for accessibility does not equal affordability. We firmly believe that giving students loans does not eliminate financial suffering, but it merely delays the burden into the future and normalizes debt culture as the price that students must pay to live and survive within the society. Education, this system financially traps them before they even begin adulthood. We do agree that Indonesia currently faces major educational inequality, which causes many students to reject a university offers and drop out midway due to fears that them and their families will struggle to pay their tuition fees. However, the root problem is not the lack of loans, but it is expensive tuition fees and unequal education access due to poor government prioritization and focus towards affordable and effective education. Instead of fixing these structural issues, Proposition thinks that the government should simply transfer the burden onto students themselves by telling them to simply borrow money. This is not the solution to inequality, but it is merely the monetization of it. Proposition argues that students' loans are safe because repayment only begins after their employment and because repayment is income contingent. Opposition believes this does not solve the actual problem. Delayed repayment does not eliminate that anxiety. In fact, it often worsens it. Because students graduate knowing that they still carry financial obligations before they even start to build their lives and careers. This pressure affects every major life decision that they make, like what career they must choose and whether they can support their family, whether they can build their savings for their retirement, and whether they can afford housing. Furthermore, Proposition assumes that graduates will easily obtain stable employment, which this assumption is wildly unrealistic within Indonesia's current labor market, which is often inaccessible and unequal to fresh graduates. Many graduates, in turn, because of the system, stay unemployed and have to work outside of their fields, which in turn would make them receive low wages and enter unstable informal sectors. In this situation, student loans become dangerous because individuals are punished for economic failures that they cannot control. Even worse, middle-income families become the most vulnerable group under the system because they are not poor enough to receive significant assistance, yet they are not wealthy enough to pay off their debts. This creates long-term financial stagnation and generational debt, forcing young adults into years of financial insecurity. Proposition team claims that student loans increase access to education. Opposition teams reject this characterization because access without financial security is not meaningful access. Instead of reducing tuition costs or improving public educational systems, opposition wants the government to simply tell students to take on debt. This does not solve the root cause of educational inequality. We think it only privatizes the burden and it monetizes it. Additionally, Proposition claims that universities will improve because more money enters the system. However, increased borrowing access will encourage universities to raise their tuition fees because students now possess borrowing capacity, which as a result, it causes tuition fees to explode and increase.
The theme of proposition further proposes a bond mechanism where students must remain and contribute within Indonesia after graduation. The theme of proposition believes this is a deeply problematic. Education should never become conditional labor. The state should not dictate where graduates work or whether they can leave the country simply because they receive educational assistance. This system restrict freedom of movement, career autonomy, and personal choice. Rather than creating genuine patriotism or national loyalty, theme of proposition creates contractual pressure that force individual to remain within system they may not wish to stay in. Citizens should contribute to society because they are supported and empowered by the state, not because they are financially trapped by it. Rebuttal to theme of proposition's claim. The first claim is scholarships are limited. The failure of scholarship system does not justify mass debt system. The solution is to expand educational funding, not replace public responsibility with loans. The second claim is debt is better than no education. This is a false dilemma. The government has alternative. Targeted subsidies, expansions of public universities, tuition caps, progressive taxation, and improved scholarship distribution. And the third claim is loans are sustainable because students repay them. A policy is not automatically successful simply because the government eventually gets its money back. A system that systemically harms students financially cannot be justified through economic efficiency alone. And the fourth claim is more graduates increase productivity. Degrees alone do not automatically increase productivity when labor absorption and job quality remain weak. Without improving labor market, proposition themes merely creates larger number of indebted graduates. The theme of opposition believe education is a public good because educated citizens benefit society collectively through higher productivity, innovation, stronger economies, and tax contribution. Then society collectively should bear the burden of funding education. Therefore, the theme of opposition supports expanding affordable public university, increasing targeted subsidies, improving scholarship accessibility, capping tuition fees, and increasing the state's investment into education through progressive taxation. These policies address the root causes of inequality without normalizing debt as a requirement of social mobility. At the end of the day, theme of proposition fails for three major reasons. First, they normalize debt as the foundation of educational access. Second, they shift state responsibility onto vulnerable students rather than fixing structural education inequality. Third one is they create long-term financial insecurity for an entire generation of young adults. The role of the government is not to turn education into a financial contract. The role of government is to ensure that education remains a right, not a lifelong burden. For all those reasons, opposition teams proudly stands against this motion. Thank you so much.